Here we have the Viper MK4. It's a ship that Faulcon DeLacy started manufacturing in 3301, 1 year after the Viper MK3. For a change, and as far as I can tell, Faulcon DeLacy actually designed the Viper MK3 and MK4 themselves, which makes a change from their usual strategy of buying out other companies and passing those designs off as their own. I'm not sure why Faulcon DeLacy decided to release the MK4 so soon after the MK3. Maybe the designers had nothing to do, since Faulcon DeLacy acquire most of their new designs from buyouts rather than designing them in-house. I'm going to get the elephant out of the room before we crack on. The Viper MK3 is easily one of, if not my favourite ship in the Elite Galaxy. I absolutely adore its looks, its speed, the way it handles. It is a fantastic ship, and there is very little that you can say or do to change my mind about that, even if it does have a few shortcomings. So you'd think that once I'd scraped enough credits together for the MK4, it would be instant love, that I'd have a new favourite steed to take me on my adventures across the galaxy. But that's not how this panned out at all. The MK4 felt heavy, unresponsive, slow. Truth be told, I didn't hate this ship, but I didn't know what it was for. It wasn't the light strike fighter that the MK3 was. The best way I can describe the feeling that the MK4 gave is that feeling when you bite into what you think is a cheddar cheese sandwich, only to realise when it hits your taste buds that it's chicken. It's a confusing feeling until you realise what's going on. Thankfully though, with a little bit of time and a little bit of perseverance, this feeling passes and it all starts to come together. Where the Viper MK3 is pinned as a light strike fighter, the MK4 is more of a combat-based multi-purpose ship. It's a bit like the Cobra MK3 in that regard, but with more emphasis on combat and a little bit less on overall flexibility. As far as looks go, it's still a good looking ship. Externally it's similar to the MK3, so the lineage is clear. However, the MK4 has a spoiler at its rear, and it has additional hull sections on the port and starboard which gives it a larger hit profile, albeit not by much at all. I'm sure that the spoiler has some sort of function, but clearly the ships in the Elite universe don't run on aerodynamics for atmospheric flight. Otherwise, ships like the Type 7 would run into real issues during planetary landings, what with having the same profile as a brick. Clearly it's just there to look cool, which I can get behind. There are less variations in the paint jobs compared to the MK3, but there's still enough to change it up to something a little bit different if you'd like to. As far as the interior goes, it's exactly the same as the MK3. It's the same basic looking materials, same visibility, etc. Faulcon DeLacy must have been busy spending capital on buying out other manufacturers rather than spending it on cockpit design, although through the external changes it's worth mentioning the cockpit has marginally less vulnerability to having its canopy shot out. But that's something I've never really had an issue with in the MK3. You'd think that given its increased internal capacity that it would be much larger than the MK3, but that's simply not the case here. Given it's 0.1 of a metre longer, 0.7 wider and 0.1 higher, it's fair to say that it's managed to retain a tiny hit profile in the grand scheme of things. As with the MK3, the boarding ramp is still built into the front landing strut, although as per any boarding ramps we can't walk up it ourselves, we merely get teleported into the ship, so it begs the question as to why it's there in the first place. Looks aside though, how does it fly? As I've already mentioned, it's less agile than the MK3 and it's slower. In fact, it's one of the least manoeuvrable small ships in the galaxy. Hardly surprising in some respects though, as the base hull mass is 190 tons, as opposed to the MK3 which weighs in at 50 tons. Oddly though, despite the extra mass, it still has the same mass lock factor as the MK3. On top of that, the Cobra MK3 has a lower hull mass but a higher lock ratio. Either there's more to it than just weight, or one of those ships is somehow bending physics. One major advantage the ship has over its predecessor is its internal capacity. The power plant, frameshift drive and thrusters have all been moved from a size 3 to a size 4, plus the optional internal slots have been hugely beefed up. They're not quite on par with the Cobra, but in terms of cargo space, it's more than double the capacity of the MK3. This means mining and trading are now viable compared to before when they weren't, and it's easy enough to buy the ship back on a single run to the resource site if you're into deep core mining. As for exploration, the Viper MK4 is an unlikely choice, but it's one that I found can work quite well. You can get 35 light years jump range fairly easily, and with engineering and an FSD booster, 50 is doable. whilst you're out in the black, this ship works really well for exobiology. You can skim a planet's surface searching for biologicals and not worry too much about binning the ship into the ground, as the hull is hardy enough to take a few minor scrapes. You can also land it pretty much anywhere, which on the rockier planets really does help. Having been in my Anaconda a lot recently, landing this ship has really been a breath of fresh air in that regard. So much less fussy on finding a decent landing zone. Combat is the last major aspect. It still maintains some of the decent aspects of the Mark III. It's got excellent convergence when bringing the weapons to bear, it's got a tiny hit profile, but it also shares the same issues around heat generation, although in my experience not to the same extent. Just goes to show that the Mark III is, well, it's made of hotter stuff. Although, as expected, the two ships do also differ. The Mark IV, as already mentioned, is a little bit wallowy in terms of handling. It's also a good deal slower. But the party piece to offset this is the protection that the Mark IV has. Its armour is twice as hard as that of the Mark III, and it also beats out the Cobra, so while you might sustain more incoming fire, the enemy is going to have to work twice as hard to destroy you. You do have to change your fighting style from the Mark III, but there's enough protection to back you up that you can happily do away with your shield and just tank enemies. It's the last thing they'll see coming, especially if you crash through their canopy. One more thing. Meet Bob. Bob, as his full title alludes to, is my chief scout swatter. This is the ship I use when I want to blow up some small Thargoids with plasma charges. Okay, so right, see this scout? Boom! That is a plasma enema right there for that Goid. I bet it's not feeling too constipated now, but that's also helped by it being in so many pieces. Truth be told, that this build isn't quite there yet to take out interceptors, but it is a huge amount of fun to hunt scouts with. Cost-wise, it's about 3 times more expensive than the Mark III at 437,000 before any discounts. That's also 100,000 more than the Cobra Mark III, but you do get better shields and armour for longevity, and if you include the Class 3 military slot, a comparable amount of space. Plus, when properly outfitted for bounty hunting, you'll be able to afford a Cobra or 3 Viper Mark IIIs in no time at all. If you look at it that way, it's potentially a worthwhile proposition. So, should you buy it? If you're after a combat-orientated multi-role ship for a reasonable price, you could do much worse. I do prefer the Mark III, but it is a little bit of a one-trick pony in comparison. It's good for murderizing, but not much else. Someone in the comments for the Mark III said that it handled like a stiff nightmare without engineering, but that's true of a lot of ships, but the Mark IV initially handles like a nightmare so stiff that depending on your plumbing you'll have issues peeing in the morning. At least considering the size and class of the ship. Hell, even the Hauler has a higher manoeuvrability rating, but where the handling on the Mark IV struggles, you can't deny it's well equipped for a fight, and with that, it's equipped to make your money back. If you want a true small all-rounder, then you might want to look at the Cobra Mark III. It's cheaper, it has better cargo carrying capability, and it can still put up a fight. But if you want to get that edge in combat from your small multi-role, spend the extra 100k and give the Viper 4 a chance. To summarise, the Viper Mark IV is a fine ship, if you don't fly the Mark III first. If you do, you may be wondering what the hell happened initially, but stick with it. With a little bit of persistence, you'll find a use for it, and you may even grow to love it. Thanks for watching. As always, I hope you enjoyed it. Usual comments around please share, like, subscribe, comment, all of that aside. Thank you so much for your support so far. I've got a way to go before getting the full hangar reviewed, but it's been brilliant seeing some of the feedback I've had so far in the comments. Thank you and have a wonderful day. 07. For the love of God, what is this, rust? I moaned that the Anaconda had some low rent bits on the interior, but rust? This is the 3300s, not the 1970s. Faulcon DeLacy really need to sort out their interior design and materials out.